that. But here we are going to be finishing up in the next few weeks. And tonight we get into 13, which is kind of spooky. Is it about the rapture? Question mark. We'll see. Spoiler. Just kidding. No spoilers. I was trying to come up with like a ridiculous would you rather. Like, do you have those friends? Shayla has this cousin who like does the most ridiculous would you rathers to his. Is it his dad? Do one of his.
Would you take it? Or, like, for no extra work, would you take it? Or would you not take it? And he sits back like this. And then his dad is frustrated because it's such a dumb scenario. There's meant to somebody, but he always answers it every single time. He's like, Dave, you have to be an idiot not to take it.
Yeah. I just wanted that because I was trying to come up with a would you rather and I couldn't. So there's your would you rather. I asked ChatGPT for one and it said, would you rather have a breadstick from Olive Garden once a week or never pay taxes? And I was like, I'll take both, please. I'll have both. But I was trying to come up with one around certainty. Okay, like would you rather have certainty that your fit was good or certainty about the end times? That was the best I could come up with, right? We want the certainty. We're all about the certainty. In fact, your generation wants certainty more than average. This is something they've actually studied. I don't know who gets paid to look at all this stuff, but man, they've looked at it. You guys want certainty more than average. And tonight's going to blow that up. Mark 13 challenges our desire for certainty about one of the most important things you can imagine, which is the end times. So we're getting down to the wire in Mark. This is the last chapter before the narrative starts rolling into the crucifixion story, okay? And this one, on the eve of his own suffering, in Mark 13, Jesus predicts a few things that spell some serious problems for his disciples. So let's read. We're going to pick up in chapter 13, verse 1. You can read in your scripture that you brought or follow on the screen. Hopefully the scripture you brought is actually the Bible. Okay. Destruction of the temple and the sign of the end times. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." "Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled?" Jesus said to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains. You must be on your guard. You'll be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all nations. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what to say. Just say whatever is given to you at the time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down or enter the house or take anything out. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter, because those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning, when God created the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. At that time, if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Messiah," Or look, there he is. Do not believe it, for false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform signs of wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So be on your guard. I have told you everything ahead of time. But in those days following that distress, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, be alert. You do not know when that time will come. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house and puts his servants in charge, each with their assigned task, and tells the one at the door to keep watch. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight or when the rooster crows or at dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone. Watch. Okay, turn to your neighbor. One thing that stood out. Go. It is a tricky passage. Raise your hand if you feel like you got all of it. Darby got it. Okay, I think we make a lot of mistakes with this one. I mean we in the sense of scholar and talking about it throughout history. There's not. I'll just give it away. There's not a consensus on what all of this means. If you go read commentaries and scholars and pastors on this, so just know that from the get-go. This is one of the trickiest passages in Scripture. But that doesn't mean I don't think there are things we can know. Okay. So tonight, what I'm trying to do, my goal is to present as best we can the things I think we can know and the things I think you got to go wrestle with and study more on your own, okay? Okay, but let's talk about some mistakes we fall into with this passage. One of the mistakes we make is thinking that this chapter is kind of like the beginning of an episode just because it's the beginning of the chapter, right? We kind of think it's like fade from black, open on sunny day, Jesus and his disciples walking along, and the line is, hey, look at this temple, and Jesus is like, bam, it's going to be destroyed, and it's like the beginning of the episode. Like, no, right? What have we been doing the last 2 weeks? We've been in the temple, right? Jesus came, Alex talked about that, and he immediately starts making this very public start to his call of this is going to have to be changed. This way that you've been worshiping, this system around the temple, the corruption of the Pharisees and the way they mistreat the people, all of this is about to get taken down and changed, right? This episode has actually been going on for a while. It started with Jesus entering Jerusalem. We're kind of at the end of the episode, if you will, okay? So we read this chapter out of that context really easily. And we can't do that. We're not going to understand it correctly if we do that. So Jesus has been setting expectations, change is coming, and his death will set all of this in motion. They just don't know that yet. And remember what he told the woman at the well a long time ago. He had that interaction with the woman at the well, and he said, soon worship won't be tied to a place, not tied to the temple, but he said you'll be able to worship spirit and in truth, right? That's good news. That's still good news for us today. But that meant something about this temple system had to change. And let's be real, whenever big systems like this change, history tells us that never happens easily. And that's what we're getting into today. So let's start at the beginning of the text. The disciples marvel at the temple. It starts with them being amazed and commenting on how impressed they are. And then Jesus is like, all this will be destroyed. And they're understandably like, okay, well, when? Let's look at the temple. It's very incredible, very imposing. I tried to put a little stick figure. Look at those doors. See how tiny those doors are right there? Those are probably, anyways, just huge, right? So they're understandably impressed. It represented economic might, God's presence, beauty. It was said that when the sun hit it, it just was hard to look at because it was so full of gold and white, really bright white stone. And so for them, this temple is huge, right? And the disciples, when they hear about its destruction, they tie that to the end of the world. We learn that more in Matthew 24. It gives us a little bit more detail. I'll be talking about Matthew 24 multiple times tonight. It's a parallel passage in Matthew's gospel. And Matthew's gospel just tends to give a lot more details than Mark does. They have kind of different goals. So I'm going to be bringing in some of Matthew and cheating a little bit on our Mark series, but it's going to be fun. But anyways, they tie this to the end of the world, right? It's the center of their world. And they want to know what's the sign to tell them when this is going to happen. So Jesus doesn't acknowledge that same connection between the end of the temple and the end of the world. And in fact, his response, he makes these two events pretty distinct. He's specific about the temple stuff. He's vague about the end of the world stuff. So we see he says to expect war, famine, earthquakes, other things. And these don't mean the end is here. He says these are the beginnings of birth pains. The beginnings. He's also warning them not to listen to false prophets who would lead them to apostasy or death. So anyways, they ask when, he responds, but that brings us to verse 5. And this is where things really take off and get weird. I just want to point out this is a marquage or a chiasm. We've talked about those throughout the series. Sorry if it's your first week, but basically it's a way that they structured how they talked or wrote back then, where there was parallel mirroring things that worked their way towards a point in the middle. And so in this one, Jesus first talks about deceivers in the beginning, and the point of that is to watch out. So he starts with watch out for these deceivers. He talks next about war, and this time he's talking about international war. So he's talking about nations against nations. There's going to be these things happening across the world. In the middle, he talks about the persecution of the Christians and how they should respond, speaking through the power of the Holy Spirit. And that is, in a way, supposed to alleviate their stress. And then he talks about war again, okay, right after that, mirroring the first time he talks about war. But this time he's talking about specific war in Judea, which is about that section. The reason I'm pointing that out, that is about the temple that's going to be destroyed and the war that is coming in the disciples' lifetime, right? I'm going through all this because if we don't, we won't be able to understand this text. And then at the end, he talks about deceivers again, saying, look, here's the Messiah. Look, there he is. Don't believe it. Be on your guard. And he says, I've told you everything ahead of time. Okay, so mistakes we make on this passage. First one, we don't put it in its proper context in the story. It's not the start of the episode. Mistake 2 stems from that lack of context. It's reading this passage as really talking all about some end-of-time event still to come, right? This is one of the biggest texts used to talk about the rapture. Show of hands if you've heard of the rapture. Yeah, okay. Okay, all right. So the rapture is actually not a doctrine held by the majority of church throughout history. The rapture being this idea that believers would get sucked up and disappear while others stay behind, maybe a pile of clothes with their, belongings left in the chair. Someone comes across it, shock, etc. Jesus' return was taught. That's a thing, okay? And with it came the resurrection of the dead and judgment. But this idea of the rapture actually came about in the late 1800s by a church leader in America named John Darby. And boy, did it take off. In North America in the 20th century, especially as you get in the 60s, 70s, my time, the 90s, early 2000s, it accelerated like crazy. A lot of that had to do with this little series called Left Behind. I don't know if you guys have heard of that. There were books, there were movies, Kirk Cameron, even Nicolas Cage got in on it at one point. People got really obsessed with end-times theology and the idea of the rapture during this period in Christian history, but mostly in North America. And then it kind of spread out from where North America started doing mission work. Okay? So if you hear about it in other countries, that's probably why. If you grew up around the theology about the rapture, I admit it's very hard to read Mark 13 and Matthew 24:25 and not think it's talking about that, because it sounds like it is, right? I remember as a kid in the early 90s, early thousands, I was so aware of this as a thing that if I heard news of an earthquake happening or a war or something, it would freak me out, because I'm like, I think it's coming. Like, it's probably like one earthquake this week and a war next week, and then if there's another thing the next week, that's probably it. Like, and you would hear adults talking about it too. It wasn't just kids. They would be like, oh, this is probably a sign of the coming rapture. And I'd be scared, and they'd be scared, and everyone's just scared. And then even recently, in the last couple of weeks, I don't keep up with like rapture news. It's not on my like Apple alerts, but I heard someone talking about like there was something happening where people were all standing in the forest, and then it, didn't happen. And I sound like I'm making fun of it. I'm not. This is really like taking some serious root. Rapture theology is based on two main passages. One in 1 Thessalonians, which I don't have time to read, and this stuff in Mark 13 and Matthew 24. In Matthew 24, the reason that it's tied to this idea of people floating up and disappearing, there's this imagery of someone being left at like the grinding wheel while another one disappears, and some other things like that. But again, we're reading now back onto that. Originally, what that passage would have been talking about was a time when someone would come, like Rome, which was about to happen, and take somebody away as a prisoner. And this parallels what happened in the Old Testament. In Ezekiel, he talks about someone taking someone away and someone left. So you actually don't want to be the one taken away in that scenario, in the way that they would have been thinking about this. And then 1 Thessalonians, where it talks about the Lord meeting him in the air, wasn't about being raptured, as we think about it, like floating up to the clouds. But rather, Paul was using this concept that was common at the time of people who lived in a place, in a kingdom, going out to meet an oncoming king as he returned, right? So it was about going out, meeting the Lord, coming back down with him in this big procession, which is much different than floating off to heaven and leaving the people who didn't say the sinner's prayer back on earth. And this all makes sense if we have our theology right about heaven. We should know we're not going to float off to another planet as disembodied souls, but in fact, heaven will come to earth. Jesus will bring heaven to earth, and we'll live here in a new heaven and a new earth. So why would you want to be taken away? So rapture theology is very new. It's American Christianity obsession that's spread elsewhere. It's based on a couple scriptures that were likely misread, and I think if you read it carefully, it's not good theology. And I put the Left Behind movies and books in the category of fan fiction of theology. The only reason to take them seriously is because they've had a serious effect. Mostly it's scaring a lot of people. I think the theological content is much less serious. And you may consider that a hot take. That's fine. Be sure I didn't get to all of this nuance in the scriptures as well as I could in a longer talk. And I grew up in Camp Rapture, okay? That was my bread and butter. I came to this view now after years of studying the scripture and listening to people who are much smarter than me, who understand what they would have been talking about as they were writing it. It's fine if that's not where you are. You can ask me questions about it after. Anyways, I say all that to say, for our purposes tonight, please just wipe your mental slate clean on the rapture stuff and just look at this text with me with fresh eyes. What does the text actually tell us about what Jesus is talking about in Mark 13? And we get there by starting with remembering he is responding, first and foremost, to the disciples asking, when is the destruction of the temple going to happen? Right? And we read that and think, oh, they asked that, but Jesus really meant to give them just a bunch of facts about the end times. But that's us importing onto the scripture. Guys, it's because we don't know our history very well. Don't make the text mean something to us based on our ideas we came up with in the 1800s. It wouldn't have meant that to them. So here's what we do know. Jesus is answering their question about temple destruction, and that is a very well documented historical event. Happened in the disciples' lifetime. You might have picked up that little part of the text that rang a bell, like, what? This will happen all? Right? Okay, so it happened in AD 70 during what became known as the First Jewish-Roman War. So major uprising of the Jewish people against Rome. The Roman Emperor Titus led the siege against Jerusalem, which was a stronghold of the resistance, and they eventually sacked the temple and destroyed it, enslaved countless Jewish citizens who had stayed to defend it. So we know that happened, and we also know it was particularly awful. There's this book, Jerusalem, a biography, and we get this account of what this was like. It's rough. I'm just warning you, but I'm reading it because I think it will help make much more sense of what Jesus actually warns them about so strongly in Mark 13. So here's the excerpt from that. I think we have it. Maybe? Yeah. Around the walls there were gruesome scenes that must have resembled hell on earth. Thousands of bodies putrefied in the sun, the stench was unbearable. Packs of dogs and jackals feasted on human flesh. In the preceding months, Titus had ordered all prisoners or defectors to be crucified. 500 Jews were crucified each day. The Mount of Olives and the craggy hills around the city were so crowded with crucifixes that there was scarcely room for any more, nor trees to make them. Titus's soldiers amused themselves by nailing their victims splayed and spread eagle in absurd positions. So desperate were many Jerusalemites to escape the city that, as they left, they swallowed their coins to conceal their treasure, which they hoped to retrieve when they were safely clear of the Romans. They emerged puffed up with famine and swelled like men with dropsy. But if they ate, they burst asunder. As their bellies exploded, the soldiers discovered their reeking intestinal treasure troves, so they started to gut all prisoners, eviscerating them and searching their intestines while they were still alive. But Titus was appalled and tried to ban these plunderings. To no avail, Titus's Syrian auxiliaries, who hated and were hated by the Jews with all the malice of neighbors, relished these macabre games. So think about that in light of Jesus' warnings in 14 through 24. It makes them make a lot more sense. He says, when you see this coming, flee. Don't get your possessions. And ironically and sadly, as you see in this account, the ones who did that went and got their coins, leaving too late, died while people were trying to steal those same possessions they worked for. Jesus had warned them. So an immediate and obvious takeaway for us is that we should take warnings from Jesus very, very seriously. Josephus, the historian of the time, noted that false prophets at the time made Jewish people stay and ascend the Temple Mount to defend it, promising it would bring their salvation. He warned specifically about that too. And all the ones who did that either perished or were imprisoned. So I say all that to point out this has to make sense for us when we come to this text of what he's actually talking about. The first layer of meaning, Jesus is warning about a very real historical event, and he's warning his people that it's coming, the destruction of the temple, even down to some of these details. So then you might ask, okay, what about the sun going dark, the stars falling? Like that didn't happen when Jerusalem was sacked, or the Son of Man coming in power, gathering. Great question, okay? So let's go back to the text. Many scholars say verse 25. Go to the next one. No? Okay. Can you pull up on that thing? Give a second. You can look at it on your phone if you have it. Many scholars say verse 25 marks a shift. Up to that point, Jesus had been focused on the temple, mostly, while also still talking about the birth pains beginning, which would indicate they would continue after the temple destruction, which we know they have. He wraps that section in verse 24 and says, "Be on your guard. I have told you everything." And then the focus changes, okay? So he moves from mostly talking about the temple to this bigger theme, which is how to live while you wait for his second coming. The exception being the fig tree imagery touches back on the temple stuff. But overall, the second half looks forward to this in-between time, between when he leaves and comes back, and how to live. It's a different layer that he's engaging with as he talks. So he starts the section by referencing Isaiah 13 and 34. That's there in the 24. But in those days, that's quotes from there. And that should signal for us this is a change in genre. He's shifting from this speaking to this genre of prophetic and apocalyptic literature. So back then, this way of speaking would have made more sense to them. They were more used to these kinds of ideas of layered prophecies. For us, now it's harder. We tend to read things as very literally. What is he exactly saying, in what order? And that's got to be exactly what it is. But the idea is simple. Prophecy can play out more than once, first in the short term, and then again in the long term. And this is how a lot of the prophecy stuff worked for them. And they would have been probably a lot more familiar with this. So layer one, again, Jesus answers the question directly. Temple will be destroyed. In layer two, he goes further. It's not just about surviving the fall of the temple. It's about learning how to live in a world of tragedy, persecution, deception, and upheaval, right? And that is where the text speaks to us, okay? Because we're still there. We're still there in that time period with wars, famines, earthquakes. The birth pains Jesus talked about beginning are still happening. We don't know if we're still in the beginning of birth pains or the middle or near the end. We just know they're happening. And the deception that he warned about, right? That is real too. How many times have you heard people talk about different leaders, talk about them as their God's chosen mouthpiece, even if their lives look nothing like Jesus? Jesus said it plain, don't be fooled. So here's the point. Text works in those layers, and we've got to keep that in mind as we keep going through this, okay? All right, so if we can acknowledge this section is more about how to live before Jesus' second coming. Again, let's go back to what can we know and what can we not know about what he says? What do we learn? And let's just address the end times thing directly, since that's what so many people come to this chapter looking for. Are there signs, right? Can we know? Can we read the tea leaves? He gives them signs before the temple. What about his return? What should we look out for? Be ready. Okay, point one. Ready? The only sign of Jesus coming back is Jesus coming back. That's it. That's all you have to look out for. When Jesus comes back, you'll know Jesus came back. I stole this from Brandon Worsham. I think it's great. He taught it at Pizza Theology probably 8-10 years ago. I think it's a really concise way to remember this idea and keep us from getting distracted from a lot of stuff. In this section about the temple, there is some lead up. He tells them when they see it coming, they will have time to flee, right? Otherwise, why would he tell them? In this section about the end, when he comes back, his whole main point in all the parables is about you don't know when it's going to happen. So just always be ready. Stars falling, bodies shaking, the earth, that kind of stuff, upheaval. And then boom, the Son of Man comes on the clouds, which is another way of saying everyone is going to see it and know what's happening. It's like, there it is, right? There's not going to be insiders who have the secret countdown. And then to add on to that, he says in verse 32, only the Father, not even the Son or the angels know. If ever there were going to be insiders on this thing, you would think it'd be Jesus and the angels and maybe the disciples. But none of them. Okay? So his whole point is just know what will happen and live as if it'll happen at any moment. Don't get distracted trying to predict it. And I think it's so ironic that we have gone to this chapter over and over to do exactly the opposite of that. So that's the first thing we didn't know. If you're confused about the fig tree stuff in 28 through 31, most scholars think that's going back to the temple destruction stuff, not his return. Otherwise, this whole generation will not pass away before these things happen doesn't really fit. He's talking about his return. Okay, second thing, he's preparing them to endure. That's what we can know from this. He's preparing them to endure. Night watchmen, right, on TV and movies, they have the stereotype of falling asleep so that people can sneak past. There's a reason. Keeping watch is tiring, okay? How much more tiring when it includes all the constant famine, wars, persecution, deception, and all the other birth pains he already promised will happen. It's exhausting. Do you ever have moments where you're just like, Lord, please come back? I'm exhausted. So he knows that's going to happen. He's preparing them. Not knowing when rescue is going to come is painful. He's not giving an exact roadmap to the future here. But he's pointing to this is the type of posture you need to have to endure this gap between when I go away and come back. He knows how much endurance it takes. And side note, think about how destructive it would be for us if we did know. We already struggle to live in light of what's coming. How much worse would it be if we thought, nothing's going to happen for another 1,000 years? Think about the early church. How much less urgency would they have felt if they knew in 2025 some schlub like me was still going to be trying to talk about this stuff, right? We don't need to know. It's the way you live without knowing that's important. We're given parables, not specifics. That's the third thing we can know about this. We're given parables about this time period, not specifics. Okay, we're going to go for a wild but important detour. In Breaking with Covering Mark, we're going to look at Matthew 24 through 25. Again, this is a parallel passage. The Gospels have a lot of these, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's a much longer version in Matthew, and these parables have important takeaways for us in understanding what we should do. So I think it's worth it. So what do we see in Matthew? Which parables does Jesus use to teach about the end times? So same thing as in Mark, he just gets done with the Mount of Olives discourse about these things happening, and we get some parables that flesh it out. First parable of the servants again, just like in Mark, but in Matthew, it's much longer, and the emphasis there is not just on the servants keeping watch. It's also this contrast of the one servant in charge of feeding the other servants and taking care of them, and then there's another servant in charge who goes, eats and gets drunk, feeds the fellow servants instead of taking care of them, right? So that's the parable of the servants there. Next one is the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. This is in Matthew 25, 1 through 13. There's these 10 bridesmaids waiting on the groom to come back. This was common in the day. The groom would go away, prepare the house, sometimes build it, so he could be gone for a while, and they're all waiting for him to come back. And in the story, they all fall asleep waiting on him, right? But it says 5 had oil for their lamps, and 5 didn't. The 5 who didn't, when the groom is getting close, are like waking up the other ones and like, hey, let us borrow some of your oil. We didn't get ours, blah, blah, blah. And they're told, no, you have to go get your own. So they'll go out to buy some, and they miss the groom returning. So the point is there will be some who will be ready to light the way when the master comes back, and some who thought they had more time to get ready. And the other point is each person needs their own faith, their own readiness. Because when the groom comes back in the story, they don't have oil to light their lamps, and they can't borrow. So the thing is, we don't get to borrow the faithfulness or relationship with God of the people we surround ourselves with. We have to build it ourselves. And then the third one, we have the parable of the bags of gold. You've probably heard of this one. Master gives different amounts of gold to his servants. The two with the most gold invest it and double it. And then the one with the least, he goes and buries it, and he says, I was afraid and hid it because I knew you were a hard man. Blames it on the master. He misunderstands the nature of the master and lets his fear keep him from stewarding wisely. For the ones that did double it, there's three parts to their reward. The master affirms them. He says, well done. So for us, we have to think with what God gives you, you want God to tell you well done or to call you lazy? He gives more responsibility to those who are faithful. Remember, this is after the master comes back, okay? So we should conclude that in the new heavens and earth, God will share with us his abundance and authority in governing based on how faithful we were with responsibility. Now, that's the point of that part. Once we were faithful with the responsibility, when the master comes back, he gives them even more. So for us, do you shirk from responsibility? Do you hide? Do you avoid commitment? Which servant does that sound like? And lastly, they share in the master's joy. That's the last part of their reward. They get to share in the master's joy. The more we are faithful with what God entrusts, the more we can step into relationship with him in this sense of sharing in his joy. Okay, then lastly, we get a very famous parable. Matthew 25, 31 through 46. And again, this is about the end times. It says, when the Son of Man comes, he will sit on the throne and separate the sheep from the goats. And this goes into the passage that is very famous. He says, later, I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was naked, you clothed me, etc. And they're like, well, when did we see you hungry and all this stuff? And he says, when you did it for the least of these, you did it for me. And we divorce that parable from its context. But he's talking about all this stuff in Mark 13 and Matthew 24. Okay, so why is this final parable here? Remember, this is a parable in this episode about Jesus overthrowing the temple and giving guidance to live before he comes back. So what does this one show us? It says both the faithful and the unfaithful are going to be unaware when they encounter Jesus. That's the point. You're not going to know. Because this isn't works-based salvation. The point is not that we're judged by how much good we do with the least of these. The point is that we're judged by what we do with Jesus. We just won't always know when we're encountering him. Just like you won't always know when he's coming back. So, what do the parables teach us? We will never be able to know when Jesus is coming back. We won't have time to tidy up our lives, get back on track, and be good for once, as if that was the point. And we have to stay ready. We have to be ready. What that means, I don't think that's just being alert as if Jesus is going to pop up over your shoulder and be like, boo, I'm back. And we're just trying to hold our eyes open with toothpicks the whole time. Right? I think Matthew is teaching us, remember the first story about the servants. This is about living in such a way that we want God to catch us doing what he told us to do all along, right? When he comes back, he catches the servant feeding and taking care of the other servants as he awaited the master's return. Not using the wine and food to get drunk and get fat on our spoils. He wants to come back and find us using the authority and gifts we have for the good of the kingdom, not to mistreat other people. So be ready yourself to light the way when he returns. Don't just surround yourself with people who are ready. Your faith is your own. You can't borrow someone else's faith when Jesus comes back. You can't wait and have time to go buy oil, just like you can't go down to the church and buy your faith at the last minute. Always be ready. Always have your priorities in order. And we learn that responsibilities and commitments are gifts to be embraced and multiplied, not to be feared and avoided. Responsibilities and commitments are gifts to be embraced and multiplied. Laziness and fear with what God entrusts us with are very dangerous, and they misunderstand the master. Even if you don't know for sure what you do will be successful, it's better to try. The master wasn't upset that the guy tried and couldn't double his money like the other ones. He was upset that the guy hid in fear and buried it. It's better to try than to bury and hide. And I hear this a lot. We don't want to commit or lead or be responsible because of fear. But again, he didn't try and fail. He just didn't try and lived afraid. And this blocked both his intimacy with the master and his ability to share in further joy of responsibility in the age to come. So don't live that way. Just don't. When you feel that fear, reject it. Responsibility is a gift. Embrace it. Trust the master who gives it to you. And last thing we learned, this one circles back to the original. We won't always know who Jesus might be identifying himself with when we're out and about. His identifying with the least of these was just this way of identifying the ones mistreated and looked down upon in their society. And we have to figure out what that is in our society. It's not always a through line in different societies. It wasn't about social class. Poor and rich alike have to repent and follow Jesus. It's not the point that poor people are inherently better. Jesus is saying basically do this always, even for the ones no one else wants to do it for, because you never know when you're doing it for a prisoner or a naked man or a rich guy everyone hates and can't stand that you might actually be doing it to Jesus himself. Again, the point is for us not to know, so we don't act differently based on what we know. Instead, we act the same. Okay, that was a lot. We covered a lot of ground over in Matthew. Let's take a breath. Hopefully we have enough of the teaching part done to now talk about what does Mark 13 actually mean for us? What should our community look like in light of these verses? So going back to Mark 13, remember Jesus is speaking in layers. There's the temple layer, layer of how they are meant to live between his ascension and return, which is still where we are. So what does it mean for us? It means three things. Well, it means more than that, but I have to make them three because it's the same. It means three things. Don't be deceived, don't lose your head, and don't be distracted. Don't be deceived is the first one. War, famine, pain, deceivers, persecution of believers, and many other things like this, Jesus categorizes as birth pains, essentially something that's beginning and will continue until he comes back. And guys, since AD 33 when Jesus spoke these words, has there ever been a time when this was not present somewhere on the planet? And often multiple of them present at the same time. In all of Christian history, is there a time when these things weren't happening? And the answer is no, right? But we love to use these markers and others as ways to predict Jesus is coming back soon or at X time. And lots of people get lots of social media followers and sell lots of books and get lots of people to come to their church by trying to do just this, predicting this thing that Jesus said we can't know. An easy way to tell if someone is a false prophet, they start saying something Jesus says they can't know. Do not listen to them. Jesus warned you about these deceivers. And if you listen to their words over Jesus's, look at what happened to the people who did that in his day. It did not end well for them. The whole point of the parables is that we can't know, and we have to trust God, to listen to him, to wait expectantly. None of these parables make sense if the lesson isn't that we can't know. They don't. They hinge on that idea. So don't be deceived. Jesus coming back will be obvious when it happens. Secondly, don't lose your head. Don't lose your head. Jesus' words here in the birth pains he describes are about expectation setting. What's life like? What should we expect? The question for us is, have you allowed these words of Jesus to shape your expectations too? Or not? He says, don't be alarmed when these things happen. That word there is the Greek word, it's throesthi, as best as I can say it. It means don't be frightened, disturbed in your mind, or troubled. Jesus is literally saying, don't be any of that when these birth pains are happening. That's a hard teaching, right? When you hear of war, famine, conflicts, deceivers, people who should love each other hating each other, persecutions, are you shook? And if you are, my question is why? Jesus seems clear here. And yes, this is a hard teaching, but I think it's one we really need to learn right now. I think we've seen over the last few weeks in the U.S. that we live in a time where there's a lot of examples Videos even of conflict, people who should love choosing hate, and lots of birth pains Jesus warned about. So how did you respond? Were you immobile by a sadness of watching another tragedy that you were forced to pay attention to? Guys, the way our algorithms work and the way media happens is really weird right now. It's not like I just came up with this. Like, lots of people are clocking this. It's like our culture has normalized kind of this like tragedy voyeurism, right? But as we do that, it just sucks away all of our empathy, energy, and emotions once we start watching this stuff. And then we watch another, and another, and then we watch someone saying something about it. It's like, picture if you had a water tower full of all the energy, emotion, empathy, whatever you have in a given week. And when you watch that stuff, it's like someone just cuts a big hole in the bottom of it and just gushes out. That's how we live on our phones like this. I want us to slow down here and honestly engage with this question. Take the last month and evaluate. How did you respond? Are you a part of one of the indignant mobs screaming out there? Were you Jonah on the cliff watching and judging a broken people you were sent to love? Were you Peter grabbing the sword to cut off the ear of the enemy? Or were you Jesus washing the feet of the ones who would soon abandon him? Again, the question is, did you lose your head or did you keep your head? Did you stay focused on what Jesus said we should do? The outraged right-winger, the outraged left-winger, the acknowledge both sides or outraged at both centrists. There's the pious Christian feeling the need to voice a platitude and make sure everyone knows what we think. What if there's a massive alternative we're missing? You want to know what I think we should do when someone's assassinated? Turn your phone off and go learn how to love someone who hates you or you strongly disagree with. I think that's a great start. If you're like, I don't know any people like that, no one really hates me, I'm kind of awesome. Maybe you're either living a little too cowardly to risk saying anything that might offend someone, or you're just living in a Christian bubble. You need to go meet some more people. So be careful with how you respond to birth pains around us. You are a human being. You are bound by space, time, and a finite amount of energy, empathy, time of day, time of life. And guys, our culture has just forgotten that massively. Social media, news, and tragedy just sucks our energy and empathy before we can give it to others, before we can give it to God, before we can give it to real people across the table from us. We're somehow okay with that. But watch the narrative of this stuff. We're supposed to have feelings, thoughts, prayers, reactions, all on point and lined up for things going all across the world. And we wonder why a lot of us struggle feeling like we have the energy to just get out of bed, pray for someone around us, and serve them, and do anything about those people's lives right here. Is that not massively flipped? What are we doing? It's begging us to act like we're not limited. We're supposed to be endlessly empathetic, sad, and yet somehow still happy and positive and grateful and thoughtful about everything. And if you're not there, keep swiping for more hacks, right? But guys, only God is love without limits. Only God is not finite. Only God can handle all of the pains of this world. You know, what the world asks of you starts with the same philosophy that they messed with at the Tower of Babel. Let's build a shining tower to the sky, this one full of all of our right thoughts and cares and responses about everything. But guys, to be human means to be finite. To be finite means the majority of the things that happen in the world will be things you can do absolutely nothing about. But don't let that lead you to despair. Don't go bury the talents in fear. Remember, your mission is where your feet are. You can't do much about most things, that is true. But you can do a lot about a few things. And I know that's risking the platitude things, but I think it's true. Go find those few things around you, and those few people, and do the best you can with the talents your abundant God has given you. So we don't lose our heads. Let Jesus' words here guide you to a place of stability that will allow you to stand strong and actually be a different kind of person when something does go crazy, which it will. It will keep going crazy. Last thing is don't be distracted. Or a distraction, that's also good. Yeah. Sufjan Stevens has this song, which I realize I'm an old head and it may not be on y'all's radar, which is tragic. But he has this song I love called Impossible Soul. It's 25 minutes long, and it's worth every minute of it. For about 3 minutes in the middle of that song, he repeats this refrain. He says, "Don't be distracted," over and over. And the instruments are just clamoring and swirling around him. It's like this irony and commentary, whatever. It's brilliant. Go check it out. It's one of my faves. But that's my last point. This one's about keeping your head down, staying focused on what Jesus did tell us instead of what he didn't. So don't get swept up in trying to figure out the end and when it will happen, but also don't forget the end is coming. Stay focused. Remember, the servants keeping watch stayed focused on the kingdom and living with the other servants in such a way as to be caught doing kingdom stuff when the master came back. But to do that takes some counting the cost. You have to relinquish your other priorities and, yes, your other allegiances that you hold. Jesus called the disciples to do this in their lifetime. Don't tie yourself to anything of the current kingdoms of the world too closely, including any nation. Jesus is warning them to be ready to abandon Judea. That's the temple, the seat of worship for God's chosen nation. I think that should make us think. There can be points where fleeing is actually the right response. Their nation was headed towards God's judgment, but Jesus doesn't tell them to stay for their nation's sake, even when that nation was God's chosen people. If you can read that and still make a case for Christian nationalism anyway, I don't think you're paying attention. God judges even his own nation. The one who stayed and defended, we learned earlier what happened. So for us, be very careful. Be very careful what hills you deem worthy to die on. If you're not sure what those hills should be, there's only one hill Jesus died on. Remember which one and why. So to close, instead of getting distracted, losing our head, being deceived, trying to predict, let's return to what Jesus does tell us and what we should do and can now. He tells us he's coming back. He's telling us a new world will be born then without evil, suffering, or pain. And that the faithful will endure to the end. Staying focused and alert. They'll have kept their oil ready to light. They'll have fed and clothed and loved their fellow servants. And in return, they're met with joy and unity with the Father, sharing in his love and abundance, and told, "Well done, faithful one." So let's be a community that lives that way. I'm going to pray and worship team will come back up.